Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me, and we'll have a little bit of a tiny chat. So give me a sense of good news, seeing and hearing. Amalfitano, thank you so much. Seeing and hearing. So it's lovely to be with you. We are in the often reheated terms I use, coming out of the bay and going into open water. That's the state of our Western democracies. And that means, as you all know, that we're not going to sink, but that 5 years out, 10 years out, we'll be further out of the bay and the waters will be bumpier. And all the meanwhile, we're going to be trying to solve global challenges and global threats that will never be insoluble, but that we will have more limited resources to handle properly than we do today. As limited as our resources today sometimes might feel, and I know that feels that way too. Most of you, in particular, when you think about Ukraine and Western strategic insufficiency. But one of the things I'm so grateful about in terms of our conversation is that we began just as we were coming out of the bay. So, with some of you who are going to stay with me, we'll be here a few years from now, we'll be further out at sea, but we would have begun our conversation much earlier. And that's going to be, I think, helpful when it comes to negotiating waters that are a bit deeper and choppier without being freaked out by them. So, when did this departure from the bay occur? You could date it to possibly the election of Trump, which you don't see, of course, as an American phenomenon, but primarily as a global phenomena to do with various mechanisms of breakdown of trust and democratic degeneration. So it's going to be interesting to see how you guys feel at different points in our tiny conversation, which I never intend to stop till death do us part. And I'm grateful that we began it early on. And I would still say, actually, at the time when a lot of people, and many people still in this community, although a minority now, I think, deny that there is a problem. And in a way, it's always wonderful when folks feel optimistic. On the other hand, I think that long-term hopefulness is best reconciled with all kinds of realism. Because when bumps come, you're ready for them, you can challenge them. Hi, beautiful Jake, lovely to see you. Let me just say that it's a remarkable achievement of Jake's to have raised 7 trillion bazillion gazillion dollars in support of Ukraine, support of getting some trucks out there, and I think it's really a phenomenal achievement, and also a testament to the power of a platform and to the faithfulness people have to a platform they trust, to work together toward an important global cause. So big up for Jake. I promised that I'd pop in and take a couple of questions that were left there early on, just before I popped online, and I'm going to do that. So let me scroll up, and I can see some questions already about Putin, but let me scroll up. Graham is asking, Jake, and that is the Jake Broe now thinks Trump will lose. Has your opinion changed? So I've been speaking for a while as though this is a 50-50 story edging Trump's way in my assessment. And I think the most interesting answer I have to your question isn't really what percentage I put in it, because these are not real percentages. These are not real probabilities. They are psychological clues. But how we deal with the fact that, on the one hand, Trump constitutes a threat to democracy. But on the other hand, seeing him as such in a very vocal and overt way, talking about him as such, might itself not be the most constructive way of handling the challenge Trump poses. There's a kind of a paradox. Let me say a couple of words about that. In terms of psychological clues as percentages, I'm pessimistic. That's to say that in terms of how I balance this today, I'm going to put it at 60 to 70% chance toward a Trump victory. That's still closer to a 50-50, and I'm not giving you an actual percentage estimation here. This is just the use of percentage points as a psychological clue to how we set expectations. A few weeks in politics is a very long time. So basically, we're looking, in my view, at a best case scenario 50-50 shot. And we've got to take the problem seriously. Now, and you all know what a challenge a Trump presidency would pose, not just to US democracy, but to US security and the semblance of an international order that we're trying to both maintain and reimagine. So let me just say something that is really in my ballpark that I think is really important. Is it, in my estimation, the case that Trump is a threat to democracy? Yes. Why is that the case? It's the case because there are politicians who, whatever we think of them, they might be far too right-wing for you, or far too left-wing for you, or far too liberal for you, whatever else. But they're people who support institutional process. They're not people who want to smash counter-majoritarian institutions. They're people who want a democracy in 2030, a democracy like the United States, to have a situation where you can kick the guys in power out, where there are counter-majoritarian checks on power, and where you have freedom of speech and the freedom not to be carted away if you say the wrong thing. You don't want a Western democracy drifting toward Hungary. The two kinds of threatening politicians are, on a low level, entrepreneurs. They're people who just serve public opinion to extract personal gain, normally power or money. And they don't care about institutions. If institutions are preserved, they're fine. If they're not, they're also more or less fine. So they are entrepreneurial, they are transactional, they are unprincipled, but they're not on any kind of mission to break democratic institutions. But and this type of politician is the norm for us. This is the sort of politician that is at risk of becoming a very, very big minority in the politics of Western democracies. But then there is a more threatening kind of politician, and that is a politician who is more positively set on breaking the game, who is more positively set on breaking the democratic game, who would like it as more than just a byproduct of their activities if institutions were smashed in a way that ends up favoring them, favoring the candidate. Trump is one of those. So I labeled Trump an anti-democratic post-truth populist. So it's very important to identify politicians like that ahead of time and to categorize them correctly. So do I recognize, if you and I are having a chat in a cafeteria, or in an academic seminar, or at the beach, do I recognize that Trump is a serious democratic threat? Yes, and it seems to me a failure of analysis to deny that. On the other hand, there's a real danger in Joe Biden coming out and saying democracy is on the ballot, as he said, and this is an existential election because the other guy wants to end the game we're playing. And it's dangerous because you simply redouble the trend that Trump is already leading and surfing, that folks who are on opposite ends in the democracy of political conflict are enemies and not just opponents. And this is a very, very difficult question. Do you treat people who label you as their enemy in a democracy as enemies or as opponents? They tell me that they're my enemy. So surely I should go out there and say that, um, uh, I see them as enemies too. And my answer here is, even if that's analytically true, the degree to which we do that has got to be really slow. Not just because it doesn't persuade anybody, it doesn't persuade anybody who is your opponent in the democratic system, that you call them evildoers who want to break the game. But moreover, saying, I am democracy and you are not, you are anti-democracy. I defend democracy, you're simply out there to destroy it. And saying that to your opponent, saying that to their support base, in itself is absolutely toxic for a democratic system. So this is a very difficult bind, a very difficult, stressful balance in which we find ourselves. And my advice is always be as slow as possible to call other people your enemies, even if they treat you like enemies, and even if they say to you that you're their enemy and that they're yours. The way out of this is to begin emphasizing the agency, in this case of Trump voters, and their repressed sense that they have been absolutely asphyxiated by the political system, that they have no place in it, they have no role in it. That's their feeling. Why do they feel like this? Let's speak to that. And let's speak to that in a way that acknowledges that we're all here in a democracy and we're trying to work out what the hell is going on. And that also means trying to explore a sense of solidarity, a sense of a public good that is political but goes beyond politics. That's to say that there is a public good that I share. I'll give my own example because I'm a British citizen. An example is that I share a sense of solidarity and a sense of public good with every single British citizen, even if I feel they're voting for things that are very much against my wishes and my interests, and even sometimes my rights. And that solidarity is about the fact that we're all in this together, and that if somebody deeply feels that they are standing for democracy, that they are making some very deep, important claim about something, that we should take that very seriously, even if we profoundly disagree on the facts and profoundly disagree on values, and even if we perceive that in the political leadership of the other side, there's a lot of bad motives. So that's the difficult balance that you and I together will be exploring for a long time, because quite frankly, this will keep getting reproduced and reproduced and reproduced. We'll be talking a lot about the states up until 2024, 2025, but we'll be talking about other elections in Western countries that are going to keep reproducing increasingly this dynamic over the years to come. And so the core question is, how do you, if at all possible, not treat people who call you their enemy as an enemy in a democracy? And you partly do that because you understand that the preservation of the game is sometimes more important than avoiding hypocritical public statements and then avoiding calling things something that they're not in public. So what you want to avoid is a situation where both parties are coming into an election, which is happening in the United States, saying if the other guy wins, that's undemocratic. In different ways, that is what Trump and Biden are saying. And Biden is obviously a constitutional politician. Trump is an anti-constitutional politician. But the point is, this is very, very dangerous. And insofar as we here have perhaps more leeway over how folks who would be more inclined to vote for Biden think and talk, we've got to reflect on what our side, and by this I don't mean Democrats, Republicans, I mean just constitutional folks. Many Republicans are constitutional, they believe in institutions in America. So, how do we folks who believe in constitutional politics, keeping our institutions on the road, how do we handle conflict more constructively and avoid for longer playing the politics of friend and foe? Piotr is asking, I've been recently wondering if the crisis among men could be one of the perhaps remote paths that we lose our democracy. So I think the crisis, first of all, is there such a thing as the crisis of men? It might be just an intellectual dark web talking point, the sort of thing that Jordan Peterson might say or might have said a few years ago. So is this thing even real, in my judgment? And yes, my answer is that it is. I do think there's a crisis of men in the West. And one of the fascinating things is that there was a certain kind of consensus that I was always skeptical about, that this crisis of men can't move south. Certainly in the European context, moving south would mean not just German and British men freaking out, but Greeks, Italians, and Spaniards freaking out. And I do think that the crisis of men has moved south too. And therefore, I think it's real. It's not just an intellectual dark web talking point. And I think it's generational. I think that the youngest generation of men has other problems, but they're no longer in that same crisis. So I would put the crisis as being 30 to 50 or 25 to 50, 25 to 45. Part of what's going on is that we have one challenging social trend, a social trend that challenges democracy, which is a trend of putting right at the center of one's life certain kinds of psychic self-realization, and in some cases, certain kinds of psychosexual self-realization. And that trend, which is, of course, an expression of what I call hyper-identity politics, is a trend that men of that generational gap tend to react to either by getting lost inside it or by pathologically rebelling against it in an unconstructive way that doesn't get to the core of the issues. So, but both moves are a case of a kind of psychological freaking out. And it's not an accident that in the English-speaking world, one of the self-help intellectual heroes has been Jordan Peterson, a man who is often on the border of existentially freaking out. I think that's actually slightly unfair about Jordan Peterson because he descends from a genetic heritage of extraordinary autoimmune-mediated mental health challenges. They're physically driven things in that family's case, it seems to me. So it's not just that this is a sort of problem that a talking therapy can address. These are biological challenges. And in that context, Peterson is, whatever else are his flaws, he is extraordinarily resilient and has an extraordinary capacity to keep going, even when he is surrounded by a precipice and an abyss underneath on all sides. But nevertheless, even though in his own case, there is a story of courage and high-level functioning there, the fact that a man who is constantly freaking out existentially is a cultural leader for a generation of men is quite emblematic. That's happening because men are freaking out. And there are ways out of this. I won't bore you with that. We'll have a separate talk about that. Maybe we could even do it on the philosophy channel. But I do recognize the crisis of men is real. And let me just give you a couple of examples of what it looks like in practice. So the getting lost too deeply in ideologies of psychic realization might mean that you write a dating profile. Let's say you're 43 years old, you're a lecturer at the London School of Economics, and you're single, and you go online, whatever are the current apps. I'm out of touch with that now. But you go on there and you say something like, in bed, I identify as being dominant, and I'm also relationally polyamorous. Now, you say that like somebody 50 years ago would have said that they're a socialist or that they're a pacifist. And you can see what problem there is with saying that you identify with a certain way of being in bed. It is pathological to have a position like that is not itself a dance-like and organic byproduct of a particular relationship defined by distinct love that you're exploring. It just doesn't make any sense. It's like somebody coming onto a tennis court and saying, I'm deeply committed to backhand drives down the line. Mate, get into a match first and express your identity as a tennis player by reacting to how the match goes. You're not going to sit there before the match starts and saying, I am a, driven backhand down the line guy. Now that might be your best quality as a player, but even a player with that quality wouldn't do that. So that's one kind of deformation, and it at one point actually caused me to write a small guide for women to online dating, which I only circulated privately because you face a lot of challenges. Now there is the reaction the other way. And the other way, no, you don't say you are polyamorous and you're dominant. You say, Jordan Peterson means a lot to me. And Jordan Peterson has got me to do this. He's got me to tidy my room. He's got me to network. He's got me to apply for new jobs. And he's also shown me why some kind of hard left threat is taking over Western countries, which it isn't. And that's because, of course, Jordan Peterson sees hyper-identity politics as a left threat, but there's nothing left about that phenomenon. And that is another way of getting lost. It's a way of getting lost where you sort of inorganically take out some cultural conservatism tokens, wave them about, but not really owning them either. And that's how you cope. But both of these responses are not getting to the core of the problem. But what I'm saying is that the problem is the same, whether you are the left-wing LSE academic in the first example, or whether you are, I don't know, some kind of aspiring conservative cultural commentator in the other example. So enough on that, but we'll get to talking about this more Hakim Zafar is asking a kind of question. It always risks being a whatabouty question. Do the Palestinians have a right? I'm going to be brief about this because I've spoken a lot about this. Do the Palestinians have a right to react after 70 years of occupation if Ukraine has a right to react? Well, I mean, quite bluntly, if you're new to me, it's not healthy for you to just have a 3-minute answer from me. There's a kind of rule that if anybody can say something in 2 minutes flat that sums up their position on the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, that means that they don't know what they're talking about. There's about 5 to 10 videos from late 2023 on this chat channel where I go through all the issues that go into a question like this. And that starts, if we're reacting to October 7th and the disastrous Israeli response, with recognizing that in what happened on October 7th, there were no liberatory credentials. And I'm afraid there is a problem, and I'll say the problem on the other side too in a moment, but there is a problem in Western public discourse, and it's also a problem in Western academic discourse of not being clear about the absence of liberatory credentials to what Hamas did. And one needs to condemn it and categorize it as barbarism. And a majority of certainly my academic colleagues in the West failed to do the two things you need to do together. That's one of them. The other is, of course, to condemn Israel's response as being completely disproportionate and unacceptable. So the number of people who have been clear on both is insufficient, and it's a kind of a moral failure. So that's one thing to say. But then another thing to say would be a conversation about Israel's right to exist. And that ends up with the conclusion that Israel absolutely has a right to exist, but that we can discuss what certain forms it takes actually mean. And there are sort of more prosaic senses of Israel being a Jewish state and sort of more dense, more ideologically rich and dangerous ways of Israel being a Jewish state that cannot be reasonably recommended as things to be accepted for Israeli Arabs or for Palestinians. And then you need to have a conversation about the fact that Israel is absolutely a real democracy. It's a democracy with an authoritarian leader at the moment who tried to break Israeli democracy by asphyxiating the judiciary, but people came to protest. But Israel is undoubtedly a democracy within the 67 borders. Then you need to take a view about what happens outside the 67 borders, and you can choose from terms like military occupation, colonial rule, apartheid. All of these are reasonable conversations. And so back to your original question, is an affirmation of the Palestinians' right to rebel against their circumstances compatible with an outright condemnation of Hamas and the actions of October 7th? Absolutely, there's no conflict there at all. But that's not a conversation what I've given you. It's the beginning of a conversation. It's not even the beginning of the conversation. It's something even more sort of embryonic. But that's how we'd start. So let's have a look. Carl Rogers is asking, could you give us more on the specifics of what we can do, what I would like politicians to do to address the democratic decline problems? Now, you know that I start these conversations with a 4x4 presentation. There are 4, very crudely speaking, mechanisms of democratic degeneration. And I won't repeat this at length because most of you know my sort of opening gambit always on this. But that is community bonds being broken by certain political and economic forces, so kind of detethering of family bonds, community bonds, intergenerational bonds. State of the social media, that we are in these fact bubbles and mental world bubbles. Various mechanisms of systemic exclusion. And fourthly, various ideologies of psychic self-realization that take the place of saying, my word, we do have some solidarity and some public good business that we share in common, no matter what our politics is. These are very polarizing ideologies. And then the four feelings people have are feeling unsafe, because their public institutions are not acting in a way that inspire trust, feeling betrayed, feeling disempowered, like there's nothing in the world you can do to inflect the political process, and the worst of all, feeling opaque. That feeling opacity, that your political institutions just make no sense. So that's why you want to throw tomatoes at them. And many of our political representatives are, in fact, tomatoes that citizens are throwing at the public institutions. Now, I can't answer your question now because it's going to be a very long list that is also going to be country dependent, but we will absolutely talk about it. What are mechanisms of democratic regeneration? And this means, what can politicians do to help with this? What do we ask of them? What do we ask of citizens? What can citizens do? And what can other professionals involved in this do better? For example, journalists. In many countries, this will mean reform of our political systems, not just different policies, but reform of our political systems that will enable people to touch politics more. In many countries, this will mean electoral reform. And this is difficult because you can't sell electoral reform easily in many democracies. It will also mean the generation of new local institutions that have a non-binding but weighty impact on national policy, for instance, citizens' assemblies. But on top of institutional reform, which is going to have to be different in different countries, you're going to need a refresh of the journalistic institution, and you're going to need politicians and citizens to stop co-conspiring in not taking politics seriously. One of the worst things that's happening now is that there's a co-conspiracy going on whereby both politicians and citizens, whose representatives the politicians are playing a game whereby politics has become 70% a soap opera, which you don't take seriously. And this is difficult because what are you talking about? You're appealing to what? To virtue? You're appealing to politicians and citizens to, reimagine their polity, act more responsibly, do civic education. These are not impactful solutions, but nevertheless, we've got to at least be clear about what it would be good for citizens to do differently and what it would be good for politicians to do differently. And earlier on, I criticized Joe Biden in this live. I criticized Joe Biden for saying that democracy is on the ballot. And of course it is on the ballot. And of course, there are some ways in which you should talk about it being on the ballot, for instance, at the level of these conversations about democratic regeneration. But it's very dangerous to say that it's on the ballot because the other guy is out to destroy it, even if the other guy is out there to destroy it. And this is not easy because I'm basically telling you Biden is kind of right but saying what he rightly thinks, at least without putting on the table a lot of what we've just put on the table, will help folks like Trump destroy the system more and help disenfranchise their voters more. Hello, Richard. Hello, Roya in San Francisco. QPQ is having problems with the stream. Let me know if anybody else is having problems with the stream. Not 50. Daimius is saying, what do I make of talk of national service? Well, it's not going very far. We've certainly had that talk in France. We're having that talk in Britain right now. The British context is that this is something that a politician who knows for sure they're going to lose says. But the way I would frame these conversations is in terms of the fact that Europe needs to wake up to its new security needs. And understand that America is not going to be always there to cover us. And we have lived in a reality in which America has sort of covered our backs. And to this extent only, Trump actually has a valid point when he complains about Europe not taking care of its own security. I noticed a couple of super things. I'll get to them in a second. So I think that this conversation, if it's to be healthy about national service, needs to be part of a wider conversation about the fact that if you are in the year 2000 and you are, for instance, a centrist or a center-left or a center-right person who is keen on human rights, keen on global justice, keen on humanitarian intervention as a topic to be debated and explored. That's to say, keen on the elbow room widening and how to live in a world in which, thankfully, the elbow room is widening. You're also in a world where you feel, wrongly, but you still feel that democracy might be spreading across the globe. And the problem is that circumstances have changed. So you can't go around saying, that's me, that's what I believe in now. Now we have new challenges and new threats. And we have to, even with the very same values, think about our security differently. You don't need to be some kind of US military industrial complex obsessed hawk to, for instance, think that it's not good if the Russians and the Chinese gulp up a country in Europe and change borders without sufficient resistance from us by force in Europe, and then threaten to change more borders after that. You see, we're still in a world where most people haven't woken up to that transformation, haven't woken up to the transformation that you need to talk not about the globalization of democracy, but about strengthening of defense. And you can do that without changing your values, but it's very hard for people to wake up to the new reality that we're in, because it still seems right for a lot of people. And that's how there's a lot of sort of skepticism of Ukraine support on the left. There is a video about that on the main channel, how much of the Western left has struggled to come to terms with exactly what it makes sense to say on Ukraine. Because there's this old, quite natural anti-hawkish tendency, and you can say, well, there's Libya, there's Iraq, there's up to a point Afghanistan, so come on, let's not keep repeating our mistakes. But the point is, it's a different world, and even with the same values, you have to respond to the different realities. So I think that's important too. I think there's a lot of people with progressive values who are passionate about human rights who don't get the fact that even for a person like that, it makes sense now to talk about taking defense seriously. That's the context in which I'd put that national service conversation. Alexei is asking, what's the point of Putin's sabotage acts across Europe? How does it affect European democracy? His aim ties in very well from what we were talking about earlier. His aim is ungovernability. He wants our democracies to be ungovernable. Ungovernability means that we'll clear out of Eastern Europe as NATO. This is an exaggeration, but it's roughly, there's something to that. If our democracies are ungovernable, then we will be easier to come to terms with the fact that we are now, asserting our alliance structures in parts of the world where we don't belong, and Putin thinks that's all of Eastern Europe. Test Tracky, my greatest fear for liberal democracies is that the growing effects of climate change will lead to ecofascism. I promise to do a main channel video about this. This is something I've been talking about for about 10 years. We are going to have anti-democratic, fascist, pro-climate political parties and movements, which seems unimaginable now, because you take the climate movement now, and unless you take a particular position on trans rights and racial justice, you're not going to be allowed into it, into many quarters of it. So much of the climate movement today is a movement that is predicated on you, if you want to join, adopting the latest instantiation of progressive values, which are subscribed to by 20% of the population in a typical Western country. You can't have a climate movement with that kind of delimited reach. So as people in the climate movement have these fights with each other, as they have fights about immigration policy, for instance, a very big dividing issue in the climate movement, what they're not realizing is that the people they call eco-fascists today on immigration, who have center-right immigration policies, in fact, are going to be replaced by real fascists who will say, you know how we're going to deal with the climate crisis? By excluding people. And the basis of exclusion will be outsiders, and we're going to decide who outsiders are. And outsiders will cover a heck of a lot of citizens who you and I all know belong as much as anyone does to our democratic polities. So this is something that's coming. It's inevitable. It's growing. If you track it on YouTube, it's still low. You're going to find some small hard right pro-climate accounts. But it's going to explode. There are going to be, if YouTube is still a big platform, there are going to be giant accounts on here with this sort of hard right, but pro-climate position. And I think that what I want to talk to you about is how to anticipate that challenge, because it's inevitably around the corner. I mean, this is the really bizarre illusion of many on the vanguard of the climate movement today, that the right, the hard right, or the anti-democratic populist right will always be in climate denial. They won't. They're going to accept the climate crisis. They just won't do it next year. But 12 years from now, they'll be a long way towards having accepted it, especially as more catastrophic climate events occur, not just around the globe, but in the West. So this is going to be, whether we like it or not, a big part of our conversation. And I'm, for health reasons, postponed writing something in the last few months about this sort of issue. But I'll let the community know when it's out. It'll be something that's off YouTube. Suzanne, thank you so much. Billy, how might US polling data change Biden's position on letting Ukraine use weapons against Russian territory? Billy's just dropped that and left. Thank you so much. There's still a lot of support for Ukraine among the US population. US citizens are still fairly supportive of Ukraine, but unlike in the UK, it's become a polarizing issue. We're going to have an election in the UK very soon, and quite frankly, and this is a problem, the positions of the two main parties on Ukraine are so wishy-washy. They're very supportive. They're wishy-washy. That it's not that easy to tell the difference between them. And so therefore it's not a very politicized issue in the UK at the moment. If the war continues for 2-3 more years, it may become a politicized issue in the UK. But in the US it is. It's certainly splitting the Republican Party. So any sense of solving the problem, any perception of Biden having solved the problem or somehow put a cap on the problem is to his benefit. The trouble is that Biden knows there is no major way in which he can achieve that. But if Biden could somehow resolve the conflict, he would love that for the election. But there is no way to do that because it's not just that Ukraine needs security guarantees, it's that the Russians need security guarantees. And the Russians need as their security guarantees something that sort of amounts to the destruction of Ukraine. So I do think Ukraine is a politically challenging issue for Biden. My sense on permission to fire on Russian territory is that that is a distinct issue from something else that Zelensky has asked for, which is to intercept Russian weapons from NATO territory as they're flying over Ukraine. That's a difficult ask. But I think the trend is increasingly to, in a limited way, liberalize Ukraine's capacity to use Western weapons on at least a stretch of Russian territory by the border. I don't think that in itself is going to be a dramatic election swinger, but the Ukraine issue is, and the sense of it being unresolved is, and Trump will be exploiting that with his fake populist nonsense about solving the problem in 24 hours. Shadow Guy from Switzerland is asking about direct democracy. I think that we are going to need more direct democracy in Western democracies, or at least more direct participation in democracy. And that means one thing that I've already mentioned, more citizens' assemblies, more capacity to perhaps somehow participate online in various kinds of votes on issues. So, this is about the generation of the perception that change either has occurred or could occur, and that you are infinitesimally part of it, right? So the kind of the paradigm of this is the local politics level, whereby the bench in the park is broken, and you get in touch with the local authorities, and 1 week later it's fixed. We need more of that kind of feeling in politics, because people increasingly feel like there's absolutely no sort of capacity for inflection at all, that I don't even have a 1 in a millionth sort of capacity to inflect the political process in any direction, even if at a local level. So the theme of these changes, many of these are going to have to be specific country by country, is going to have to be, have we got citizens to feel they can touch politics more than they've felt that they could touch politics before? Erasmus is asking a question about Swedish far-right party using trolls on social media. This is going to get worse for a while because a lot of unlovely activities online, particularly in the run-up to elections. I'm not talking about Russian intervention in our democracies, and I'm just talking about our own toxic conflicts. At the moment, we have no idea about how AI feeds into this, and we have no way of regulating it yet. No sufficient way of regulating it yet. So we're going to be in a kind of open waters period for a while, where AI allows people in a way that we don't regulate to unconstructively reach voters with, for example, false factual information. Cheryl is saying that Biden is too mild on Ukraine. Again, the Biden perspective, and you know my entire story that we barely have a strategy at all toward Ukraine, but the Biden perspective is Ukraine has survived. We've kept Ukraine going, and it looks like it will survive as a nation state. The Russians have been embarrassed at several points in this, and their military capacity has been degraded. NATO has been strengthened, and Europe has been woken up to its need to take its own defense more seriously. These are 4 brownie points for us, so don't say we're useless. That's the Biden administration response. My response to that is that that does not constitute a strategy, but then my further understanding response is that is it even possible to create a strategy with the current democratic incapacity that we're stuck with in Western democracies? And my answer to that is yes, to a degree of 20%. So let's use that and do better. But there's also kind of a block on how far we can create a strategy because of the state of our democracies, our incapacity to get a strategy going. Collective West is saying even if NATO left Eastern Europe, then Putin would see us as a Russophobic threat to Moscow. He'd still try to destabilize us. He'd try to destabilize us, but do know that there is this big distinction, I think, in the heads of the Kovalchuk brothers, Patrushev, Putin, that the West is not ours. I'm talking on their behalf now. They don't think France is theirs in any way. They don't have anything to do with France. They don't have anything to do with Germany, or at least West Germany. Whereas they basically think that Poland is just stuff that the West has appropriated greedily and really isn't going to, in an overly committal way, stand for when push comes to shove. But they do make that very big distinction. So it's not a kind of a limitless imperialist reach that never stops. I think there is a sense of that being true too. But the kind of a borderlessness that we've discussed is there, and of course a kind of functional militarism is there too. But I do think there is this major distinction that Russia has no claim on the West in the minds of these hyper-obscurantist imperialist maniacs. But they do think that Russia has some claim on Eastern Europe, or at the very least, the West has no claim on it, which in their minds means no NATO there. Braden Davis is saying, how can I get the pro-climate people on board with international institutions like the IPCC? They seem far too pessimistic about their institutions' ability to act in a relevant time frame. Well, if you're talking about pessimism about our institutions to act in a relevant time frame, that's probably right, and tragically right. I do think the majority of people in the climate movement respect the IPCC. Some don't. Some think that the IPCC is too conservative. Um, but what I would in general say about the spirit of your question, this is what I say to people in the climate movement, is you're not going to get anything done unless you push it through a democratic system. And so if you lose your democracy, you're not going to get any climate policy done. So understand that and don't speak about our democratic institutions as though it would be good if in some world we just got rid of them. That's idealistic at best and at worst just pre-political. So I completely tie democratic sustenance with climate action. But I'm not saying that keeping our institutions in the most realistically possible healthy way is compatible with massive climate action. It's not. Our institutions are still captured by fossil fuel interests in a significant way. And this is not a conspiratorial point to make. There's plenty of evidence for this. That doesn't mean that each individual politician is corrupt. It doesn't mean that. What it does, although some are, but what it does mean is that it's damn hard to get things moving. But it also, of course, is the case that climate policy is painful, and the pain is inflicted upon democratic citizens who may rebel against that, and you need their vote. So these are very difficult problems to move. But what you don't get any benefit from is simply saying that our institutions have had it, they're corrupt because they're just not going to solve the problem. Well, if they're not going to solve the problem, then whatever happens if they lapse, it's just going to be worse. So that's why my appeal to the climate movement is always to say, look, guys, ask for radical change, but don't desire to smash our institutions, because if you do that, you're just going to have Viktor Orban. You're not going to have net zero. Let's have a look. President Reagan is saying if Russia's borders don't end, then they also don't begin. There's a certain kind of truth in this, and that is expressed in the staggering indifference of the Kremlin when something goes wrong in Belgorod Oblast. They almost treat it as though it's a foreign country. If they can get away with treating it as a foreign country, then they would. And that's why also we have to understand that what that regime calls an existential threat to Russia, they just mean an existential threat to their power. That's what, when it comes to, for example, their nuclear rhetoric, they really mean when they talk about an existential threat to Russia. They are dazzlingly indifferent, to the point that if they had to bomb Russia instead of bombing Ukraine to keep power, they would. They felt they could get away with it. Lord of the Toolshed is saying, Vlad, how do we ensure victories over the anti-democratic populists like the one that took place in Poland recently aren't purely temporary? How do we drum up enthusiasm post-electoral victory? They are going to be just temporary, and you have to accept that, because you're not going to love it if your political opponents came to power, the anti-democratic folks, and they tried to make their victories permanent. Nobody's victory is permanent in a democracy. But what we can do just goes back to the conversation I started with earlier, which is to talk about regenerating our democracy and to talk about a crisis of democracy that is in a way that's a conversation that includes all citizens. Because what we risk doing too much is saying, hey, we have a crisis of democracy. By the way, you know whose fault it is? It's the 30% of the other side who voted for the wrong person. So that's the crisis of democracy. Change their minds, get rid of them, brainwash them, just send them to some other country, and we'll have no problems. That's precisely what we don't want to drift toward. What we want to drift toward is how come people feel the way they're feeling and what can we do to make them feel differently, and we care passionately that people feel how they feel, which is of course an approach to political difference that doesn't start with understanding political difference as simply an expression of intellectual error on the other side's part. Concretely, as I say, I do think this means institutional reform, and I do think it's going to take different forms in different countries. And I do think we need a conversation. What can citizens, what can journalists, what can politicians do differently? And we will be having that. Collective West as democracy is an evolutionary journey shared across generations, not a single point in time. I think that's a bit of wisdom that some politicians also could take on board. That's to say, try to get praised 20 years from now for what you did and not just in the moment. What helps the sustenance of the system, what helps keeping the show on the road, which sounds like a kind of a conservative, pessimistic enterprise. But of course, it's only if we keep the show on the road that we can do any kind of radical policy on any issue. Yes, Bobby's talking about addressing money in politics. The idea that money is speech is an absolutely insane and insupportable idea for any democracy to get stuck in. Money is power. As Kudus is saying, if our democracy is not working for the benefits of all people, then what's the point of keeping it? I think that's an important question. But I think that if our answer to it, well, let's bring it about that the people who we've asked to fix the situation are not vote outable, that's not going to help. That's not going to help. So you see, it's a kind of a magical question you're asking. You're sending an envelope into a place that doesn't have an address. It's not that you're proposing something else. So when you're proposing to get rid of this stuff, that is indeed, as you rightly point out, not working for the benefit of all people. You're giving a ticket to the local Viktor Orban, and that's going to not work for the benefit of all people even more. If you think that Viktor Orban is working for the benefit of all Hungarians, I don't agree, right? And you don't agree as well with that. So we've got to be realistic about the fact that however we cut it, we don't want to bring it about that our courts don't work at all, that we can't vote out the guys in power, and that they've taken over our universities and our media, that they control it. Carl Rogers is asking about how should democratic politicians speak about their potentially anti-democratic opponents. by welcoming them into the democratic game and holding off as long as possible before labeling them people who want to end the democratic game. You could label them as such, but then more than doing that, you have to say that what they're actually doing is representing or exploiting the democratic frustrations of good and decent citizens. Trump exploits the democratic frustrations of good and decent citizens. And so that starts with a focus on the agency of the people who vote for the other guy. This is really hard because when it comes to political opposition, there's little room for collegiality and people do not like each other genuinely. I mean, Biden genuinely thinks Trump is an absolute disgraceful calamity. But we've got to be humble. We also got to accept that there could be criticisms of Biden, and there certainly are. At the Democratic level, there are. I won't legislate on them now, but certainly there are questions about Biden running initially in 2020 in a way that allowed him to win only under very special circumstances, I might say. So he lucked out, and if he hadn't, he would have had a very serious question to answer about sitting there and saying, "Hey, I want this power because I believe I'm going to be effective if I hold it, and effective at making the country better. But I want this power, even if me running will mean that there's a greater chance for the opponent to win." Well, he sort of lucked out of needing to have that conversation largely because of the pandemic and Trump's mismanagement of it. But without that, Trump would have probably won. But it means that you have to treat the other side's support as though they are making important claims that need to be taken seriously, and as though they have some kind of weighty matter of principle on their side that you can't just dismiss as delusional irrationality. As it happens, that practical judgment about Biden, whether he is an effective political operator, in my view, Biden was right about. I do think, even though he does not look effective, and that is itself a great democratic danger, it's entirely possible that Biden's cognitive decline swings the election to Trump. It's entirely possible. But his cognitive decline, which is real and serious and must be talked about and must not be conflated trivially with his stutter, is compatible with him actually being an efficacious decision maker. Objectively speaking, and this is not a praise of Biden's policies, but he's a slightly more effective politician, just at getting things done, whatever he wants to get done, than Obama. But it doesn't look like it. The appearance and the reality are at a vast distance at the moment. But you talk to the other side really by elevating the support group of your opponent. IMIPAC 23 saying about the UK elections, there's going to be an election in the UK where the Labour Party will finish as the winner in early July, and the Conservative Party will be significantly defeated. And the other parties won't do particularly well, but the Tories will have a bad time. We're one of the few countries with first past the post. How would proportional representation change UK political culture? I'll give you one argument of many for proportional representation, but don't let's not get confused here. When we talk about changing the electoral system, this is a practical thing. So there are always very many different options, many different versions of proportional representation too. So that always needs to be discussed in a country context. But what it would do is potentially free centrist parties from pandering to extremes as much as they feel they now have to. So I'll give you a specific example of a pattern this could make less toxic, but it won't necessarily do that, but there's a chance it could. And that is that the tendency for right-wing parties all over Europe is to drift toward being anti-democratic populists, right anti-democratic populists, from being constitutional conservatives who support institutions. If it was easier for the populist right folks to form their own party and get elected with it, get into parliaments with it, this would alleviate the pressure of the mainstream parties to triangulate and accommodate the more unconstructive extremes. So in the UK context, electoral reform could make it easier for the Conservative Party to make the right decision when it's going to have to make a decision after it loses the next election about whether it's going to go toward being a center-right, a more moderate center-right pro-democratic party, or whether it's going to go in the Liz Truss, Boris Johnson direction, who are Trumpian, anti-democratic populists out to destroy counter-majoritarian institutions. They're not just entrepreneurs. They are not just entrepreneurs. They're out to destroy democratic institutions. And the Conservative Party in the UK could more easily resist that if guys who were on the anti-democratic populist right in the Tory party could form their own party and actually get somewhere with that in politics. So a moderation of the destructive tendencies imposed on mainstream parties is one arguable positive. One of the downsides is, of course, you're going to get more extremist views acquiring power because it's going to be more minority parties. And sometimes that could be good. Sometimes that could be very bad. Overall, the judgment I recommend at the moment in UK is that the case for electoral reform is very, very strong. And I'm not sure if that's true, actually, but I think my wonderful public intellectual colleague John Gray has changed his mind about this. I think he used to be against it and now is in favor of it, unless I've made that up. That my instinct is that John has evolved on this. And so I think the case for electoral reform in the UK is strong. Rachel is asking, could I explain George Galloway, the UK politician? Yes. So there are unpragmatic leftist politicians like Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy is very different to Bernie Sanders. Very, very different indeed. And one of the differences is that Bernie Sanders is much more a politician and Corbyn is much more a political organizer and activist. So Corbyn is a principled leftist who is politically unproductive and unconstructive and naive and happens to have no leadership skills because he's not a sort of a living, breathing, walking, talking politician. So we can distinguish Bernie from Jeremy, but then I'm saying don't think that George is like Jeremy, a sort of pre-political leftist. George is a political entrepreneur who rides the waves of public opinion for personal advancement. That's not the only thing that you can say about him. He does have principles, but he is entrepreneurial rather than sort of impractically principle driven as a politician. He's a guy who's going to see a gap in the fence and is going to find a way to get through it if nobody else is utilizing that gap. And he's going to make a career of it. He has to remain roughly faithful to some of his credos, but I would categorize him as being, to a degree that is excessive, an entrepreneur exploiting public opinion and the waves of political sentiment. So I think that's George. And you can see that reflects it in his latest activities pretty well too. I'm not saying he's lying when he's committed to. He's not when he's saying he's committed to Palestinian rights. But unlike Jeremy Corbyn, he's not acting out of this sort of core, sustained principle. He is a political businessman. For him, politics is business. Jeremy Corbyn is a very good political organizer. He is great at running, as he was involved with various sort of coalitions, the And Stop the War coalition around the time of the Iraq War. That's his niche. His niche is not political leadership. I mean, he's a guy who can sit on national television, and it's completely obvious what three things one would say in order to try to win, and he'll avoid saying them. So that's Jeremy. And of course, obviously, sorry, I didn't mention it, but of course, George Galloway has formidable qualities, and his oratory can be very compelling. Yeah, so I do not recommend a high pedigree of trust being given to Galloway as a political actor. Cheryl is asking, why aren't there any more liberal Democrat party members in the UK? Well, I think you mean members of parliament. I think I say this rather crudely, but I think that at the moment, what the Lib Dems are doing is trying to fight a constituency by constituency fight. So if you talk to the Lib Dem folks today, they start saying, well, we're going to try to win this seat. I think we've got a good chance, and that's our strategy there. And the strategy is local, right? It's what we need to do to win that particular seat. And then they've got these four, and I think, we're doing 7 things in that seat and 3 things in this seat. And I think, that's really, really sensitive to the local context, and we're trying to do it seat by seat, piecemeal. But guys, what is your national strategy? What is your politics? And also, why aren't you a party that takes a strong pro-EU stance, given that the Labour and the Conservatives haven't done it? Why haven't you done this? And their answer is, this may be good for British national politics, but we also want as many Lib Dems in parliament, and the best way to do that is not to have a national first campaign. It's to have a set of tiny little microfights that might maximize our presence in parliament. So they've made the national message secondary. And I think that is an abrogation of responsibility by a major national party that has a big pedigree, a lot of people voting for it. I do think that they have left a gap at the level of a national message. So I am concerned about the identity of the Lib Dem party at the moment, but we'll see how they do. So, beautiful community. Let us gently begin winding ourselves down. I've been very grateful that you've joined me. Um, I am doing different tests and medical procedures until sort of early to mid-June, and that just means that I'm a little bit slower on here, and that we're a bit slower with the 2 or 3 main channel videos I have planned. So I hope to be more regularly and more intimately connected with you just a tiny, tiny while from now. And I'm very grateful for you to have stuck it with me for this this period of a few weeks when I've not been able to be as connected with you as I would like. Very, very grateful to everybody for joining. Thank you very much. I'm not sure when yet, but the next main channel video is a video on Russian propaganda's impact on Western politics. And I hope to see you then, but before I'll see you several times on the main channel. Amalfitano, thank you so much for your astonishingly generous help. It means so, so much. And everybody, thank you. Rachel, thank you. Take very good care. Until soon. Lots of love, and bye-bye for the moment.